They laughed when he said his dad worked at the Pentagon, but they stopped laughing when the school went into lockdown. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of room 203 at Jefferson Academy, casting long rectangles of light on the waxed floors. The air inside was crisp and quiet, broken only by the distant clatter of lockers and the chatter of students finding their seats. Isaiah Brooks sat at the edge of the third row, his backpack neatly tucked beneath his chair, a brand new notebook open in front of him, its pages untouched and waiting. It was his first day. Not his first day at school. He was in 5th grade. After all, but his first day at Jefferson, one of the most prestigious private schools in Washington, D.C. The school had marble staircases, state-of-the-art science labs, and a student body made up mostly of children whose last names matched buildings downtown. Isaiah didn't come from that kind of legacy. His mother, Naomi, worked in community services. And his father, Derek Brooks, well, no one at school knew what Derek did. That was the way they'd agreed it should stay. No one knew that Isaiah's dad worked at the Pentagon. Not as a secretary, not as an assistant, but as a strategic operations director with a clearance so high that even his own son didn't know all the details. It was a family decision to keep his father's identity quiet, at least until Isaiah could find his own place in the new school, make friends, be himself. He smoothed the front of his uniform shirt, tugging slightly at the collar. His grandmother had helped retwist his hair the night before, and her words still echoed in his mind. "You walk proud, Isaiah. You don't need to shrink for anyone." The bell rang, sharp and final. Students hurried to their seats, conversations cut off mid-sentence. The door opened, and Ms. Margaret Tate walked in, heels clicking against the tile, clipboard in hand. She looked every bit the part of an elite private school teacher, blonde hair tied back tightly, cardigan buttoned to the top, pearls in her ears. Her eyes swept the room like a scanner, stopping on each student for half a second until she reached Isaiah. A pause, barely noticeable, but it was there. Her lips thinned. Then she moved on, calling roll. Isaiah sat up a little straighter. As the morning passed, he followed every instruction. Raised his hand when he knew the answers. Kept silent when he wasn't sure. During reading, he took careful notes. During math, he solved problems quietly while others whispered. But despite his best efforts, Isaiah began to feel something unsettling, a cold sort of noticing. A silence that carried weight. When his class was assigned a short essay on their favorite summer memory, Isaiah wrote about the science museum trip his parents had surprised him with, how he got to hold a meteorite and used real lab equipment to simulate a Mars landing. He worked hard on the draft, even adding details about how he wanted to become a scientist one day. When he handed it in, Ms. Tate glanced at the paper and set it aside without a word. At lunch, a freckle-faced boy with messy hair named Logan Bennett asked if he wanted to sit with him and a few others. Isaiah accepted, grateful for the offer. The boys talked about video games, comic books, and the upcoming science fair. For a moment, Isaiah felt like maybe this place could work. But when they returned to class, the difference was unmistakable. Ms. Tate returned their essays, handing out grades with a tight smile. Logan had written about a soccer camp and got an A. Isaiah, whose paper was longer, carefully written, and full of facts, saw a red C scrawled at the top. His heart sank. Around him, most students had A's or B's. He tucked the paper quickly into his folder before anyone else could see. That afternoon, it got worse. When he raised his hand to answer a question about American presidents, she ignored him. When he asked to sharpen his pencil, she made him wait while 3 other students went before him, students who hadn't even asked. During art class, she breezed past his desk without offering help, though she stopped at every other student in the row. At the final bell, Isaiah packed his things slowly. He thought about telling someone, his mom, his dad, even the school counselor, but something inside him said, wait. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe he was imagining it. As he walked down the hallway, he passed the frosted glass of the main office. Through it, he saw his father, Derek Brooks, speaking calmly with a faculty member. He must have come by to check something administrative. They hadn't entered the building together that morning. They never did. Just as Derek turned to leave, his eyes caught Isaiah's. He smiled and gave a subtle nod. Isaiah managed a small smile back, but it didn't reach his eyes. At home that night, when his mother asked how the first day went, he gave the safest answer he could think of. It was fine. Naomi studied his face for a moment, but didn't push. She trusted her son to talk when he was ready. Derek, who had arrived home an hour later after a late meeting, asked too. Isaiah simply nodded. In bed, Isaiah stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleep finally came. He thought about the look on Ms. Tate's face. Not mean. Not angry, just something else. A quiet dismissal. Like she'd already decided who he was without ever really hearing him speak. He thought about his dad, how his eyes always scanned every room, how he walked into places like he belonged there, even when people doubted him. Isaiah wanted to be like that. Wanted to learn how to carry himself the same way. But deep down, something told him this year at Jefferson Academy wasn't going to be easy. He would have to prove himself. Again and again. Still, the words of his grandmother wrapped around him like a warm blanket as he drifted off. Walk proud, Isaiah. You don't need to shrink for anyone. Tomorrow, he'd try again. By the second week at Jefferson Academy, Isaiah Brooks had mastered the art of staying small. Not physically, he was already tall for his age, but in presence. He learned how to enter a room without drawing attention, how to answer questions in a way that didn't sound like he was trying to show off, and how to smile politely when someone mispronounced his name for the 3rd time. But what he couldn't learn, what no book, no training, no whispered advice from home could prepare him for, was the tightening in his chest every time Ms. Tate looked his way. It wasn't what she said. It was what she didn't say. How she passed over him during class discussions, how she handed out compliments like candy to some students and crumbs to others. And how the silence that followed Isaiah felt just a little too intentional. One morning, she called him to the front of the class to solve a math problem on the whiteboard. Isaiah stepped forward, determined to prove himself. He'd reviewed the night before. He knew the material. He started working through the equation, writing neatly, confidently. Then came the voice from behind him. "We don't have all day," Ms. Tate said, tapping her foot with pointed impatience. The words hit like a slap. Isaiah's hand trembled slightly as he finished the final line. It was correct every number, every step, but she didn't acknowledge it. She didn't say, "Good work," or even nod. Instead, she pointed to his seat and called up the next student, Lisa, a girl with blonde pigtails. Lisa worked slowly, erasing twice, stumbling through the math. Ms. Tate leaned in with a soft smile. "Take your time, dear," she said sweetly. "Math can be tricky." but you're doing just fine." Isaiah sat at his desk in silence, his fists clenched under the table. That afternoon, in the cafeteria, David leaned across the lunch table. "My mom's a teacher," he said quietly, "and she says stuff like that isn't okay. Teachers aren't supposed to treat kids differently." Isaiah shrugged, pushing the apple around on his tray. "Maybe she's just tired," he said, though he didn't believe it. The breaking point came during history class. They had been assigned to present short talks on their family heritage. Isaiah had worked hard on his spoke about his grandmother, a retired civil rights activist who had marched in the streets of Selma and helped organize voter registration drives in the South. He talked about how her strength had shaped his entire family, how her story inspired him to dream big. He stood at the front of the classroom, voice steady, hands folded, wearing a shirt his grandmother had ironed that morning. And then came the interruption. "That's enough, Ms." Tate said abruptly, even though the classroom timer showed he had 2 minutes left. Isaiah blinked, confused. "I still have—" "We need to give the others a chance," she said firmly. The next student, Tyler, gave a rambling story about a vacation to the Bahamas. He went over his time. Mrs. Tate laughed and called it charming. Isaiah returned to his seat, cheeks burning. Word began to spread. It wasn't just what she'd said. It was how often it happened. Other students started to notice how Miss Tate wrinkled her nose when she passed Isaiah's desk. How she always seemed to call on someone else, even when his hand had been up the longest. How she never missed a chance to correct him publicly, but never others. During a faculty lunch break, Mrs. Tate was overheard saying, "I just don't understand why they have to wear their hair like that. What happened to looking presentable?" She didn't name Isaiah, but she didn't have to. Teachers shifted in their seats. Some looked away, but Mr. Hale, the science teacher, made a point of walking by room 203 more often. Sometimes he asked for chalk, sometimes he needed to borrow a ruler. But Isaiah knew. Someone saw him. One day, Ms. Tate held up Isaiah's essay and made a face, pinching it between 2 fingers like it was contaminated. "This handwriting is impossible," she announced to the class. David read that essay later and told Isaiah, "It was one of the best ones I've seen." Still, she marked it AD. But something started to shift. David began asking Isaiah to explain answers in Class 7 when Ms. Tate ignored him. A few other students followed suit. When Ms. Tate tried to move past Isaiah during art class, Emmy, a girl who rarely spoke, raised her hand and said, "You forgot him." Isaiah started to notice small acts of rebellion. Someone wrote, "Fair is fair," in pencil on the corner of the whiteboard. Others started styling their hair differently in solidarity twists, braids, curls. Some did it imperfectly, not quite understanding the deeper meaning, but Isaiah felt it anyway. He wasn't invisible anymore. In Mr. Hale's science class, Isaiah thrived. His experiments were detailed, creative, full of thought. In art, his projects were displayed in the hallway. In PE, he was always picked first for teams. But in room 203, his grades kept dropping. And at home, sleep became harder. Naomi noticed Isaiah was quieter at dinner. He didn't talk about school like he used to. He picked at his food, offered short answers. Derek came home later than usual, busy with a classified project. But Isaiah could feel the weight of the silence between them growing heavier. In the halls of Jefferson Academy, students started whispering. Teachers exchanged looks. The secretary in the front office began jotting down strange moments she overheard. Everyone could feel it. Something was building. Something was going to give. And in the middle of it all sat Isaiah Brooks, his homework completed, his posture upright, his spirit still intact. Because no matter how cold the classroom became, he remembered the words whispered into his ear by his grandmother as she twisted his hair the night before the first day of school. "Baby, you are made of fire. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The Wednesday sun streamed through the windows of the art room, casting warm squares of light onto the tiled floor. For a moment, the space felt calm-filled, with the familiar rustle of scissors cutting paper, the low hum of students chatting about the fall festival, and the scent of glue sticks and crayons. Isaiah sat at his usual table, carefully cutting orange construction paper into pumpkin shapes. His movements were precise, quiet. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he just wanted to do it right. Across from him, David was wrestling with his own creation, insisting that his jagged, lopsided leaf was an example of modern art. Isaiah smiled softly. Even now, David tried to keep things light. But when Mrs. Tate approached their table, her shadow fell across Isaiah's work. She didn't say good job. She didn't ask if he needed help like she did with everyone else. Instead, she stared at his project, her voice low and sharp. "Well, I see you're following instructions for once." Isaiah didn't look up. He didn't reply. He just kept cutting, pretending the curve of the pumpkin stem needed his full concentration. A few students nearby shifted in their seats, eyes flickering toward the tense moment, then quickly looked away. They had seen this before. They knew the tone, the pattern, and they also knew how helpless it made them feel. Miss Tate turned at the sound of someone calling for more glue, and just like that, the pressure lifted. Isaiah reached for his water bottle, took a small sip to steady himself, and continued cutting. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. And then it happened. Isaiah felt something cold, something sticky, touch the top of his head. At first, he thought someone had spilled water. Maybe David's bottle had tipped again. But the sensation was wrong. It wasn't wet. It was thicker, heavier. The smell hit him a second later, not the soft scent of school glue. This was chemical, strong, sharp. He reached up slowly, his fingers brushing something tacky, already hardening. He turned. Miss Tate stood behind him, a small open bottle in her hand. Not the regular glue, super glue. Industrial strength. The room fell silent. The silence was louder than any scream. A pencil clattered to the floor. A gasp came from somewhere in the back. No one moved. Isaiah froze, his hand still in his hair, his eyes locked on the bottle. "Oh my," Ms. Tate said, her voice thick with fake concern. "What a terrible accident. I must have grabbed the wrong bottle." But no one believed her. Not Emmy, who sat across the aisle and remembered exactly where the craft glue was kept in plastic squeeze bottles with orange caps. This bottle was metal. It had come from the locked supply cabinet. Not David, who saw the key on Miss Tate's lanyard, the way she had reached for it earlier, and not Isaiah, who had felt the weight of her gaze for weeks. He didn't cry. He didn't scream, but inside him, something shifted. Something that had bent for too long finally started to rise. Before Miss Tate could take another step, David stood up, knocking his chair over. "I'm getting the nurse," he said, his voice trembling. He didn't wait for permission, he just ran. more students stood. One by one, voices rose. That wasn't the right glue. You had to unlock the cabinet to get that? You didn't help him, you just stood there. Ms. Tate's face lost its usual color. Her hands, once so quick with correction, now trembled. Isaiah sat still, his carefully twisted locks lovingly styled by his grandmother only days ago were stiff, brittle, sticky. This wasn't just about hair. It was about history, about identity, about a part of him that couldn't be separated with scissors or wiped away with a towel. But through the noise, the footsteps came fast. Sure. The nurse. Behind her, Mr. Hale from the science department appeared too. His face, usually kind and quiet, was tight with concern. The room transformed. Isaiah was taken gently from his seat, ushered to the nurse's office where warm water and cotton pads met cold glue and wounded dignity. Photos were taken for documentation, for protection. Mr. Hale stayed close. He didn't say much. But he was there. In the hallway, David stood guard at the door. Other students, Emmy, Grace, Logan kept their phones close, videos ready, photos saved. Not for gossip, but for proof, because they had seen enough. In the front office, word spread. Fast, parents were called. Administrators whispered behind closed doors. The security footage was reviewed. Ms. Tate was asked to wait in the principal's office. She didn't teach another class that day, and somewhere in that building, Principal Derek Brooks received a call he had never expected, one that would test his balance as both a leader and a father. But Isaiah didn't know that yet. All he knew was the quiet pain in his scalp, the sick feeling in his stomach, and the truth he had carried for too long. He wasn't imagining things. He wasn't being too sensitive. And most importantly, he wasn't alone anymore. The students who had once stayed silent were finally speaking. The system that had overlooked subtle cruelty was being forced to see it clearly. And as Isaiah sat in the nurse's chair, a cold compress on his scalp and his dignity slowly stitching itself back together, he realized something simple but powerful. This would not be the end of his story. This finally was the beginning of change. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights filled the nurse's office as Isaiah sat still, a damp towel pressed gently against his scalp. Nurse Lena Ruiz worked with delicate hands, her movements slow and careful. Every few minutes, she paused to document another photo with her phone close-ups of the hardened glue, the irritated skin beneath, and the still shiny spots where adhesive had begun to dry into stiff patches across Isaiah's tightly coiled locks. "How does it feel now?" she asked softly. Isaiah winced. "It burns. A little." Lena nodded solemnly. "We'll keep rinsing. But I want to be honest with you. Sweetheart, this isn't just something we can wash out." He didn't say anything. He just stared at the white linoleum floor, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Outside the nurse's office, the school had come alive with a different kind of energy. Students whispered in hallways, teachers peeked through classroom doors. The story was already spreading like wildfire, carried on fast fingers, texting friends and classmates. Ms. Tate poured glue on his hair. "He didn't do anything, she just did it. They say it was an accident, but everybody saw it." Back in the front office, staff scrambled. The phones rang non-stop. Parents were arriving, some in tears, some in fury. A few teachers stood off to the side, shaken, exchanging worried glances, and then came the voice none of them expected. Firm, deep, quiet, but unmissable. "Where is my son?" Principal Derek Brooks had returned. He had stepped out only an hour earlier to attend a district meeting, his usual suit crisp, his mind focused on school reform. But one call had shattered that routine. It wasn't a formal report, not an email, not even a voicemail. It was a student's mother, breathless and angry on the other end of the line. "You need to come now. Something happened to Isaiah." Derek didn't wait for the full story. He didn't finish his coffee. He didn't make another call. He left the meeting room, got in his car, and drove faster than he had in years. Because today, he wasn't just the school principal. He was a father. He burst through the main entrance, past a receptionist frozen mid-sentence, past students who stood aside instinctively. His polished shoes echoed sharply down the hallway until he reached the nurse's office. Lena looked up as he opened the door. Their eyes met. Her face said it all. Without a word, Derek stepped inside and dropped to one knee in front of the examination chair. "Son," Isaiah blinked once, then turned his face away. "It's okay," Derek said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm here now." It was only then that Isaiah's composure cracked. A single tear slid down his cheek. "I didn't do anything," he murmured. "I know," Derek replied. "You don't have to explain. I believe you." Outside the door, David and Logan stood guard. They didn't speak much, but they refused to leave. Emmy was seated on a nearby bench, her fists clenched tightly in her lap. None of them had gone back to class. "We're waiting to make sure she doesn't get away with it," David said flatly to a passing staff member. "Someone's got to say something." Back in the nurse's office, Derek stood and turned to Lena. "Tell me everything." She nodded, steady as ever. "She used superglue from the locked cabinet. Isaiah says he didn't see her open it, but several students did. She made a comment before it happened, something about him finally following instructions for once, and then she poured it on." Derek's jaw tightened. "And now? She's in your office." "They told her to wait." He exhaled slowly. "Has anyone else touched his hair?" "No, sir." "Don't let anyone, not even the district rep when they get here. Document everything, and send me copies of your photos." Lena nodded. "Already done." As Derek stepped back out into the hallway, the weight of his dual roles settled across his shoulders like bricks. He was the principal of Jefferson Academy, but right now, he was also a father trying not to fall apart. Back in his office, Miss Tate sat stiffly in the visitor's chair. She had her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her lips were pressed into a flat line, the same tight expression she had worn when reviewing students' essays with disdain. But this time, there was no clipboard, no stack of papers, just silence. Derek entered the room slowly and closed the door behind him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Just stood there, eyes locked on hers. Then he spoke. "You poured superglue on my son's head." Ms. Tate opened her mouth. Don't say it was an accident." The words came sharp, final. Her mouth closed again. He walked to his desk, then stopped. "I need you to understand something," Derek said, voice low and steady. "For weeks, I've had teachers come to me with concerns about your behavior. Students avoiding your class, parents raising eyebrows, and I've defended you. I've said you were tough, but fair. I told myself you held students to high standards, but I was wrong." He leaned forward just slightly. What you did today wasn't discipline. It wasn't teaching. It was humiliation. It was violence, and it was racially charged. Ms. Tate looked down at the floor, her hands still folded. I didn't mean for... Derek cut her off with a wave of his hand. This isn't about what you meant. It's about what you did. Outside his office, students had begun gathering wordlessly, instinctively. Not with signs or chants, but with presence. A silent protest. Inside, Derek tapped a button on his intercom. "Mrs. Holloway," he said to the secretary, "please call the district superintendent. Tell her this is an emergency." "Yes, sir," her voice came back immediately. "And then call legal counsel." He turned back to Ms. Tate. "You're being placed on immediate administrative leave. Effective now. You are not to speak to any students, staff, or media. And you are not to return to this campus unless instructed in writing." He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. "You've done irreparable damage to a student, to a classroom, to this school." Tate stood shakily, her eyes darting to the door. "Am I being fired?" "You'll be hearing from the district board," Derek replied. "But if it were up to me alone..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. As Ms. Tate left the building, escorted by security, Isaiah watched from the nurse's window. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. But a slow breath left his body. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could finally exhale. The following morning, the atmosphere at Jefferson Academy was unlike anything it had been before. It wasn't the usual shuffle of students dragging their feet to homeroom, nor the familiar drone of locker doors and announcements. It was quieter, more alert, as if the entire building had collectively held its breath. Word had spread far beyond the walls of room 203. Teachers whispered about it behind closed doors. Students shared videos and screenshots from the art class incidents, some blurred, some shaky, but all telling the same story. Parents were now involved, flooding the school with calls, emails, and demands for answers. By mid-morning, the front office phone rang so often it had to be rerouted to district headquarters. But the most unexpected shift was happening among the students. Isaiah arrived at school under the careful watch of his father's chosen security officer. Dressed in a simple jacket and cap, the man stayed several paces behind, but his presence was unmistakable. As Isaiah walked through the school's main hallway, he noticed the silence that followed him. But it wasn't hostile this time. It was different. Some kids nodded at him brief but meaningful acknowledgments. Others gave him space without judgment. And a few, the ones he least expected, stood a little straighter when they saw him walk by. Near the library, a girl from his history class stepped forward. Her name was Maya. She didn't say much, just placed something gently into his hand before stepping back again. It was a handmade bracelet. Braided with red, black, and green threads, the colors of the Pan-African flag. "For strength," she said simply. Isaiah swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Thanks." In the teacher's lounge, however, the mood was far less supportive. Ms. Tate's empty chair sat like a ghost among them. A few teachers shifted uncomfortably whenever her name was mentioned. One muttered something about overreaction. Another wondered aloud if this would lead to unfair scrutiny of educators just trying to do their job. But not everyone stayed silent. Mr. Gregory Hale, the science teacher who had always kept to himself, finally spoke up. "What happened wasn't a mistake," he said, placing his coffee cup firmly on the table. "It was a pattern. And we all saw it. Some of us chose not to act. That stops today. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to, because truth has a way of making the walls echo. Later that afternoon, the district superintendent arrived on campus. Dr. Evelyn Granger was known for her no-nonsense attitude and signature navy blue suit, and she wore both like armor. She spent the entire day interviewing staff, reviewing footage, and speaking directly with Isaiah and his family. By the time she left, her face was tight, her tone clipped. This incident, she told the press gathered outside the school gates, has raised serious concerns about the culture within Jefferson Academy. We will be conducting a full investigation and immediate equity training for all staff. But it wasn't just the district taking action. The students were moving too. A group of 8th graders began organizing a silent sit-in for the following morning. David and Logan were at the center of it, typing up flyers in the library after school with help from several volunteers. They didn't shout, they didn't block hallways. They simply planned to sit together, quietly, outside the front office, with signs that read, "Justice for Isaiah." We saw it. We won't forget it. Respect is not optional. Word traveled fast, especially among students who had long felt invisible. By evening, the local news had picked up the story, the footage from the classroom, the accusations, the suspension of a veteran teacher, and the twist that the student involved was the son of Principal Derek Brooks, a detail that no one could ignore anymore. At home, Isaiah sat with his parents in the living room, watching the coverage. His mother, Naomi, held his hand tightly. "This wasn't supposed to happen to you," she whispered. "But it did," Isaiah replied, "and now everyone sees it." His father said nothing at first, just leaned forward and turned off the TV. "You okay? If this keeps going public?" Derek finally asked, "because it might not stop here. And once the media takes hold of something, it grows faster than we can control." Isaiah looked between his parents. "I don't want this to be about me," he said quietly, "but I also don't want to hide." That was all his father needed to hear. The next morning, true to their word, the students gathered. Before the first bell rang, over 70 students had taken their seats on the polished floor outside the main office. Some held signs, others simply sat in solidarity. Staff walked by, some unsure how to react, but no one tried to stop them. And when Principal Brooks stepped out of his office and looked at the scene before him, he didn't ask them to leave. He sat down beside them. The silence in that moment said more than 1,000 speeches ever could. Later that day, he addressed the school over the intercom. His voice calm, resolute. "This week has been difficult, not only because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. As your principal, I take full responsibility for creating a space where every student feels seen, valued, and safe, and where no teacher, no matter their experience, is beyond accountability." His words were brief, but they sparked change. By Friday, the district had appointed a new counselor specifically to handle equity and student well-being at Jefferson. A review of grading practices and classroom behavior had been launched, and students were invited to share their stories not just about Ms. Tate, but about every microaggression that had gone unchecked for too long. As Isaiah walked through the halls that day, he felt something shift. Not everything was fixed. Not yet. But things were moving. Not because someone shouted, but because someone had finally listened. And this time, they wouldn't look away. It started like any other Wednesday afternoon at Jefferson Academy. The sun spilled through the tall windows of the art room, painting golden streaks across desks cluttered with craft paper, glue bottles, and student chatter. A soft hum of creativity filled the space as students worked on their decorations for the fall festival. Laughter, scissors snipping, whispered jokes. It felt normal. Isaiah Brooks sat at his usual spot near the back, his hands carefully shaping orange construction paper into pumpkins. His work was neat, intentional, detailed, traits his grandmother always praised. "Everything you make carries your name," she'd told him once. "So do it with pride." Across from him, Logan was struggling with his craft. "Mine looks like a deflated tomato," he muttered, trying to pass it off as modern art. Isaiah smiled, offering a quiet laugh. For a moment, he felt at ease, but then she walked by. Ms. Tate. She moved between the desks with her usual air of control, a box of extra supplies in hand. Her eyes flicked across the room, watching, judging. When she reached Isaiah's desk, she paused, not to compliment his work or ask how he was doing, but to make a point. "Well," she said coldly, "at least you're following instructions for once." The words hit like a slap. They didn't need to be loud, just sharp enough for the kids nearby to hear and shift uncomfortably in their seats. Isaiah didn't respond. He kept his head down and kept cutting. That moment should have passed like the others. Another quiet insult. Another public jab. But something was different this time. A few minutes later, while Isaiah leaned forward to grab his water bottle, he felt it. Something cold, heavy, sticky, land on his head. For a second, he thought someone spilled paint. But then the smell hit him. It wasn't paint, it was glue. Not the washable kind sitting on their desks in bright plastic bottles. No, it was super glue, industrial strength. Chemical-laced, dangerous. His hands flew up, instinctively grabbing at his hair. The glue was already thickening, clinging to his tightly coiled locks like it had been waiting to ruin them. His breath caught, his eyes darted up, and there she was. Ms. Tate standing over him. Holding the now half-empty bottle, the room went silent. One student dropped a pencil. Another gasped, and Ms. Tate, without missing a beat, said with syrupy sweetness, "Oh my! What a terrible accident. I must have grabbed the wrong bottle." A lie. Everyone in that room knew it. The regular glue bottles were bright orange-topped. The superglue came from a locked cabinet, only accessible with a key Ms. Tate wore around her neck. There was no mistake, there was no confusion. This was a choice. Isaiah froze, panic beginning to take over. His scalp burned, his vision blurred. But still, he said nothing. Years of being told to stay composed, stay calm, don't overreact, all of it, bottled up in his silence. But the silence didn't last long. David, a classmate who had always kept his head down, stood up so fast his chair scraped across the tile. "I'm getting the nurse," he said, his voice firm. "Sit down." Mrs. Tate snapped, but David was already out the door. That small act opened a floodgate. Emmy, another student, stood up. "That's not the craft glue," she said clearly. "The real stuff is in squeeze bottles. That came from the supply cabinet. I saw you take it out before class." Others began speaking up too. "You didn't help anyone else with glue. You went straight to his desk. You always treat him differently." In the span of 30 seconds, a room full of kids, most of them. White did what no adult in the school had done so far. They defended Isaiah. Ms. Tate's face changed. The calm cracked. Her voice wavered. "It was an accident," she said again, quieter now. But it didn't matter. No one believed her, not anymore. Minutes later, the nurse arrived with Mr. Hale, the science teacher. One look at Isaiah and his chemically soaked hair, and they rushed him out of the classroom. The glue had started to harden, pulling painfully at his scalp. Isaiah didn't say a word as he was led down the hallway. He didn't need to. His face said everything. By the time they reached the nurse's office, word had already spread. The hallway was lined with concerned teachers, staff, and students, some stunned, some angry, all waiting for answers. His father arrived 20 minutes later. Derek Brooks wasn't wearing his principal's badge when he entered the room. He wasn't wearing a smile or a suit. He wasn't the composed administrator who usually led morning announcements or shook hands at PTA meetings. He was just a father, and his son had been assaulted. The moment he saw Isaiah, hair stiff and sticky with damage, eyes brimming with humiliation, Derek's jaw tightened. He walked over, knelt beside him, and said the only words a father can in that moment. "I'm here." The investigation started immediately. The evidence was undeniable: the glue bottle, the witnesses. The security camera in the corner of the room that captured the moment of impact. But the deeper truth, that this wasn't just about glue, was finally being heard. Ms. Tate was suspended that same day. The district launched a full review. But more than that, something irreversible had happened. The students saw it. The parents saw it. And now the entire community saw it. This wasn't about misbehavior or misunderstanding. It wasn't about a teacher having a bad day. It was about bias. About harm. About the price of silence. Isaiah sat quietly in the nurse's office that day, watching his father pace with a phone to his ear, speaking to district leaders, lawyers, and board members. And for the first time, he realized something. The fight wasn't just his. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a voice, and finally, people were listening. The nurse's office had always been a quiet corner of Jefferson Academy, an out-of-the-way space filled with cartoon posters, antiseptic smells, and the comforting presence of Mrs. Lena Ruiz. But on that day, it had become the eye of a storm. Isaiah sat on the examination table, the superglue stiffening his hair like wire, tugging uncomfortably at his scalp. Mrs. Ruiz worked gently, using warm water and mild solvents to lessen the damage, but even her careful hands couldn't undo what had been done. The chemical had already burned his skin in places. She paused for a moment, her hands trembling just slightly. Then she turned and picked up her phone. "I'm going to document this," she said quietly. "You don't need to say anything, Isaiah. Just sit still." She took several photos of his hair, his scalp, and the half-empty glue bottle still sitting on the counter like a piece of damning evidence. Her professionalism never wavered, but Isaiah could feel her anger beneath the surface. It wasn't loud. It was the quiet, kind, measured, righteous, and deeply maternal. Meanwhile, outside the room, students gathered in whispers. Word had spread like wildfire. A teacher had poured glue on a student's head. Not just any student, Isaiah Brooks, and not just any teacher's. Margaret Tate, the one who always seemed to look through him like he wasn't really there. David stood near the door, pacing nervously, keeping curious onlookers at bay. A few classmates sat on the floor in the hallway. Emmy, who had spoken up in class, was now texting her mum, trying to explain what had happened in case someone tried to twist the story. And Miss Tate. She stood alone. Near the end of the hallway, she leaned against the wall with her arms crossed tightly, her face pale. The confidence she wore like a shield had cracked. She kept repeating the same line under her breath, as if saying it enough times would make it true. It was an accident, just a mistake, just a mix-up. But no one was buying it anymore. The glue bottles were stored separately. The craft glue was soft, colorful, and child-safe. The superglue came from a locked cabinet. Mrs. Ruiz knew it. So did every teacher who'd ever prepped an art lesson. 6. Tate had used a key to retrieve that bottle, and students had seen her do it. And now, they were speaking up. In a small circle near the nurses' station, Mr. Gregory Hale, the science teacher, gathered testimony. He wasn't official administration, but he'd always been the one students trusted when things felt off. One by one, students told him what they'd seen. Not just that day, but in the weeks prior. She rolls her eyes when Isaiah talks in class. She skips over him when she's asking questions. She told me not to sit next to him during partner work. She called his handwriting sloppy, but his is better than mine. I saw her smile when she poured the glue. Each voice added weight. Each story chipped away at the image miss. Tate had tried to present to the school for years, and while all this was unfolding, Isaiah's father arrived. Derek Brooks entered with the calm of a man who had been in life-or-death situations before, but the fire in his eyes said this was different. This wasn't just a principal walking into a crisis. This was a father facing the unimaginable. He took one look at Isaiah, sitting on that table with his hair matted and his shoulders slumped, and something inside him shifted. He placed a hand on his son's back and said softly, "We'll handle this." Then he turned to Mrs. Ruiz. "I need a full report. Photos, everything. You'll have it," she nodded. Derek didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm through the halls. He simply walked to the main office and closed the door behind him. But within an hour, the district superintendent was on the phone. By the end of the day, every teacher in the building had been asked to write a formal account of the incident. Ms. Tate had been escorted off campus not in handcuffs, but with a staff escort and a locked file folder in hand. And most important of all, the students had seen it. They'd seen what happened. They saw who stood up, who stayed silent, who told the truth, and who didn't. That night, Isaiah sat quietly at the dinner table, picking at his food. His mother reached across and gently placed her hand over his. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready." But Isaiah looked up, eyes steady. "No, I want to, because it's not just what she did. It's how no one stopped it until today." His father nodded solemnly. "I know, son." Isaiah's voice shook, but he kept going. "She hated me for who I am. She didn't say it out loud, but I could feel it every day. And everyone else felt it too. They just didn't know what to do about it." His grandmother, who'd joined them for dinner, folded her arms slowly. "They know now." Outside, the sky was dark, but inside that small kitchen, there was a new light. Isaiah wasn't just enduring anymore, he was being heard. Principal Derek Brooks stood in his office, staring out the window at the quiet parking lot. His hands were clasped behind his back, jaw tight, expression unreadable. But behind the stillness was a storm he was barely holding back. In all his years working in education and national security before that, he had never experienced a moment quite like this, when the role of principal collided so violently with the role of father. Isaiah was his son, and someone had poured super glue into his son's hair, not just someone, a teacher, under his leadership. A woman who stood at the front of the classroom and called herself an educator. But now, everyone knew. The school secretary had delivered her witness statement an hour earlier. Mr. Gregory Hale had collected over a dozen first-hand student accounts, even the school nurse, Mrs. Ruiz, had added her voice firm, unwavering, and deeply disappointed. At that moment, Superintendent Dr. Evelyn Granger entered the office. "I came as soon as I could," she said, setting her briefcase on the desk and taking a seat across from him. Derek nodded. "Thank you. We need to move swiftly." "Have you spoken to Ms. Tate?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not directly. Legal wants us to wait, but the facts are mounting. We have video evidence. Photographs, student witnesses." She accessed the locked cabinet herself. "This wasn't an accident." Dr. Granger looked at him carefully. "Would you feel the same if it weren't your son?" There was a long silence. Derek's shoulders remained square. "Yes," he said firmly, "but it is my son. And the system should work for him too." They both knew what he meant. Too often, the system had failed boys like Isaiah, failed to listen when they said a teacher treated them differently, failed to believe when they described the subtle digs, the silences, the small humiliations, failed to act until it was too late. But this time, the silence had broken. Later that day, a school-wide announcement was made. Ms. Tate had been placed on immediate leave pending investigation. A substitute teacher would be brought in for room 203 starting the next morning. Students were invited to speak with the school counselor if they'd been affected by the incident. And then, something else happened, something no one had planned. One by one, students began coming forward. Not just from room 203, students from years past, from other classrooms, from earlier grades. They began telling stories, some on paper, some quietly whispered to teachers they trusted, some through their parents, who called the front office with tight voices and trembling restraint. "She humiliated my son about his handwriting. She told my daughter her hair was too messy for a presentation. She refused to let my child retake a quiz after being sick, even though other students were allowed. And in nearly every case, the student had been black or Latino. For years, Ms. Tate had operated unchecked, protected by her seniority, her polished parent-teacher demeanor, and a reputation built on surface professionalism. But now the surface had cracked, and the community was watching. That evening, at a hastily arranged school board meeting, parents packed into folding chairs in the auditorium. Local reporters showed up. Representatives from civil rights organizations took notes. Principal Brooks stood at the podium, steady and composed, but his voice was heavier than usual. There was no anger in his words, just truth. What happened in room 203 should never happen in any classroom. Not in this school, not in this country. We failed a student. We failed several. And now we must act. He took questions from the press, from parents, from board members who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, now forced to confront a reality they'd previously dismissed as hearsay. One mother stood with tears in her eyes. My son told me 2 years ago that she treated him differently. I didn't want to believe him. I thought maybe he was just being sensitive. I should have listened. Others nodded. Then a father, in a worn army jacket, stood up. "I'm not here to point fingers," he said. "But I want to know what this school plans to do to make sure no kid gets treated like my son did." Principal Brooks answered calmly. "We begin with transparency. We've already initiated a review of past complaints involving Ms. Tate. We'll bring in third-party investigators to ensure objectivity. We're also implementing mandatory bias and equity training for all staff before the semester ends." He paused. "And I will not oversee a school where silence is easier than accountability." The room was still for a moment. Then someone clapped, and slowly others joined in. The next morning, Derek sat beside Isaiah at the kitchen table. The boy's hair had been partially salvaged thanks to Mrs. Ruiz and a specialist his wife found in town. Still, some of the curls were gone cut away with the hardened glue. Isaiah didn't complain. He wore his short-cropped hair like a badge. "I'm proud of you," Derek said, setting down his coffee mug. "You stayed strong. You didn't back down." Isaiah didn't say much, just nodded. He had learned that not every battle required noise. Sometimes the loudest statement was just showing up again with your head high. When they pulled into the school parking lot, Derek placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You good?" Isaiah nodded. "I'm not hiding," he said simply. Derek watched him walk toward the building, surrounded by a group of friends who had, over the last few days, stood with him not out of pity, but out of respect. That afternoon, Isaiah returned home with something in his hand, a folded note, scribbled in pencil. He handed it to his father and said, "She wrote this before she left." Derek unfolded the paper. It read, "I didn't believe you'd speak up. I was wrong. I hope someday you'll teach students better than I did. Because you already carry more integrity than I ever did." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The message had already been received by everyone. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable day in room 203, when silence turned to courage and one boy's resilience pulled back the curtain on a deeper truth. Springfield Middle School, once just another quiet building in a suburban district, had transformed into something few thought possible, a model of accountability, inclusivity, and hope. Isaiah Brooks no longer walked the halls with the weight of being misunderstood. His steps were steady now, his shoulders square. Teachers greeted him with respect, not suspicion. Students waved, not because he was some overnight celebrity, but because they saw in him what every school should celebrate, a kid who stood tall when it would have been easier to disappear. The school walls were still the same faded beige, the bells still rang at the same hour, and the cafeteria still served pizza that was a little too chewy, but something had changed. And not just for Isaiah. Every staff member at Springfield had gone through mandatory bias and equity training. New policies were posted in every classroom, clear rules on student treatment, grading practices, and the reporting of concerns. And perhaps most importantly, a new culture of speaking up had taken root. Principal Derek Brooks had kept his promise. He didn't let the storm blow over. He'd worked with Superintendent Granger to ensure every prior complaint against any faculty member was re-reviewed, especially those dismissed too quickly or without proper investigation. Some teachers quietly moved on. Others stayed and changed. Mrs. Margaret Tate, once considered a veteran of the district, had officially resigned after the investigation confirmed long-term patterns of discriminatory behavior. Her departure wasn't celebrated, But it was necessary. No one cheered. But no one mourned it either. Sometimes healing means learning to say goodbye to what never should have been allowed to stay. Isaiah's classroom was now led by a young, passionate teacher named Ms. Daniels. She'd transferred in from a nearby school, drawn by the district's new commitment to equity and inclusion. And from the moment she stepped in front of the class, she made one thing clear. Every voice matters. Every story counts, and in this room, no one is invisible. Isaiah had smiled the first time she said that, because for the first time in a long time, he believed it. In the months that followed, a school-wide diversity council was formed, not just for optics, not just to check a box, but to actually listen to students. Isaiah served on that council, along with his best friend, Logan Bennett, and even a few students who had once sat quietly while Ms. Tate's behavior went unchecked. Change, Isaiah learned, wasn't about calling people out. It was about inviting people in. The school counselor, Mrs. Lena Ruiz, who had been the first adult to truly validate Isaiah's experience, was now the official staff advisor to the council. Together, they organized school-wide assemblies on empathy and fairness, hosted parent workshops, and even created a buddy program to help new students feel supported. One of their proudest moments was the unveiling of a new mural in the school's main hallway. Designed and painted by students, it depicted children of all backgrounds standing together beneath the words, "Seen, heard, valued." When Isaiah's dad saw the mural for the first time, he stood still for a long while. He didn't say much, just put a hand on Isaiah's back and nodded. "Let's make sure they always mean that," he finally said. At home, the Brooks family also felt the shift. Isaiah smiled more, laughed louder. At dinner, he shared stories from school, something he hadn't done in months. His mother, Naomi, often teared up quietly at the table, listening to her son recount stories of being asked to lead a science project, or how he'd helped a younger student navigate their first week at Springfield. One Friday night, as Derek tucked Isaiah in, a tradition he had never let go of, even as his son grew older, Isaiah asked him, "Do you think it's really over?" Derek paused. "I think the worst of it is behind us," he said gently. "But the work of making things better, that's something we keep doing." "Together," Isaiah nodded. "I want to be a teacher someday, like the good kind." Derek smiled. "You already are, son. You've taught more people in this school than any lesson plan ever could." That spring, at the district town hall, Superintendent Granger invited Isaiah to speak. The auditorium was full. Parents, teachers, even city leaders had come to hear about the changes at Springfield. Isaiah stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady. "I used to think I had to shrink myself to fit in," he said. "But now I know I was never too much. I was never the problem. The problem was silence." He paused, then added, "If you want your school to change, don't wait for someone else to speak up. You be the one." You might be surprised how many people are waiting to stand beside you. The crowd rose to their feet, not because Isaiah had said something rehearsed, but because he'd said something real. That night, as the sun set over the quiet neighborhood and the school hallways darkened for the weekend, Isaiah stood outside the mural in the empty corridor. He looked up at those painted words, "Seen, heard, valued." And for the first time, he truly felt all three. In every community, there comes a moment when silence can no longer be an option. The story of Isaiah Brooks reminds us that standing up against quiet injustice can spark change louder than any protest. Isaiah didn't raise his voice to start a fight. He stood tall with grace and persistence, even when the odds were stacked against him. And his courage wasn't just about defending himself, it became the seed of transformation for an entire school. For those of us watching from a distance, especially older generations, we know how deep bias can run and how hard it is to change systems built on exclusion. But stories like Isaiah's show that change begins with one voice, one truth, and one act of decency. In our daily lives, we each have a choice to look away when unfairness appears, or to lean in and ask, how can I help fix this? Whether you're a teacher, a parent, a neighbor, or just someone who believes in fairness, your actions matter. And sometimes, simply believing a child's story is the first step to healing a broken system.